Welcome, friends. Thank you to this study of the Holy Scriptures. We're glad that you found time to join us as we examine a thing that occurred in John the 13th chapter. John the 13th chapter, 14th, 15th, and 16th chapters are those that record the teaching that Jesus gave to his disciples the night of the Passover, after he'd washed his disciples' feet, and then after he had instituted what was his memorial supper. And then as they departed from the room and went toward the place where he would pray his fervent prayer in John 17. In the midst of the supper, after it was done, Jesus washed the disciples' feet. And when he had done that, then sadly, he told his disciples, one of you shall betray me. This really created a great anxiety on the part of the disciples. They did self-examination, and they asked the Master, is it I? And Jesus said, it is he that I shall dip the sop in and give to him. And when he did that, he dipped the sop, gave to Judas, and said, what you do quickly. So Judas departed from the midst of the disciples. Jesus told the disciples then that these things I've told you beforehand, that when it comes to pass, you will know that I am he. Jesus did many marvelous things to prove that he was who he claimed to be, the Son of God. His miracles, of course, were astonishing. He had authority over the seas, over the winds. He could transform a few loaves and fishes into sufficient food to feed 5,000 on one occasion, 4,000 on another occasion. He was able to cause the blind to see, raise the dead, gave health to those that were very ill. Those are things that said who he was. And on one occasion, when those that were persistently unbelieving, they said, tell us, are you the Christ? He said, I have told you, but you not believed. He had told them by the miracles that he had wrought. We find that on one occasion, Jesus spoke to those that were ones that were the rulers and would put him to death. And he said, when you've lived to death the Son of Man, then you shall know that I am he. And the events that were during the time of his crucifixion and the events afterward were those that let the rulers know on no uncertain terms he was who he claimed to be, though most of them would never acknowledge it. But as we look at the events that are before us in John the 13th chapter, Jesus says, I've done these things. I've told you these things beforehand so that when it comes to pass, you may know that I am and who I am, that I am he. And as Jesus speaks of those things, he is speaking of not only his miracles, not only the fact that he was able to perform the things that he did and other wonderful things, but that was another proof of his divinity, was his divine wisdom and knowledge. He knew what was going to transpire, who knew what was going to take place. Jesus knew the world around him. He knew what was happening into it. He knew what had happened before. He knew what was going to happen afterward. We find that this marvelous character of Jesus is manifested in one, that he knew about people, what they were going to do, what they had been doing. We find that in John the first chapter, that Philip goes and seeks Nathanael and says, we found the Messiah. He's Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael said, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And Philip said, come see, Nathanael. So as he came to Jesus, Jesus said to him, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no guile. And Nathanael was astonished. How do you know me? Whence did you know me? And Jesus said, why, Nathanael, before Philip called you, I saw you under the fig tree. That was a reflection of Jesus' powerful knowledge, of his divine knowledge. Not only was that true, but we find that on another occasion, Jesus was going through Samaria. And when he went through Samaria, he stopped at a little town called Sychar by a well that was outside of the city called Jacob's Well, because Jacob was purported and believed to have given the well to those that were descendants there. A woman came out. Jesus engaged her in conversation, a Samaritan woman. And at length, we find that when he had said, if you'd asked of me, I would have given you living water, whereby you would never thirst again. She finally said, give me this water. And Jesus said, well, go call your husband. She said, I have no husband. She said, you said, well, you've had 5 husbands, and the one with whom you're now living is not your husband. This that you says, I have no husband. Verily, thou speakest well. Jesus was thoroughly aware of this woman and her life through the whole of it. On another occasion, Jesus was walking, and the disciples were murmuring against themselves. And he questioned, what was it that you were talking about? And they were reluctant to tell him. They were murmuring, they were quarreling about which one of them was greatest. And Jesus told them, the one that's going to be greatest in the kingdom, greatest among you, is the one that becomes servant of all. Jesus not only knew what men were doing, had done, he knew of events that took place, which reflected his divine wisdom. We find that on one occasion, on the day that the world calls Palm Sunday, the day in which our Master rode, as Zechariah had declared that he would, into the city on a colt, a foal, an ass. He sent his disciples into the city and said, you go in that city, over to the town next to you. You're going to enter it, and you're going to find a donkey. She's going to be tied, and with her is tied her colt. And you take that colt, and you bring it to me. And if anyone says, what do you mean, listening to the colt say? The Master has need of it, and he'll let you bring it. So the disciples did just as Jesus told them to. They entered into the city. And when they entered into the city, the village over against them, they found the 2 animals, just as Jesus said. And when they unloosed that colt, those ones that were standing around said, what do you mean loosing the colt? And they said what Jesus told them to say. And they let them bring it. On another occasion, we find that Jesus with his disciples had reflected that wisdom. These individuals were ones that were talking with Peter. And Peter had engaged in people in conversation about whether Jesus paid the temple tax or not. And he said, yes. So Jesus inquired of Peter regarding that. And he asked them, of whom do the kings take tribute, Peter? From strangers or from the sons? And he said, strangers. And Jesus, well, then the sons are free. But lest we offend them, you go over to the village that's close to you, or rather go to the sea. You cast in it a hook. And the first fish that comes out, you're going to find something in his mouth. You're going to find a shackle. And that'll be payment for you and me, the temple tax. On another occasion, when Jesus was preparing for observing the Passover with his disciples, the record declared that he said, you go into the city, and when you enter into the city, you're going to see a man walking, and he's going to have a pitcher of water. You follow him. You follow him where he goes, and the house that he enters into, you talk with the master of that house and say to him, the master says, where is the guest chamber that I might keep the Passover with my disciples? And he's going to show you a large upper room. They're prepared, make ready. And just exactly like Jesus said, they went into the city. They saw that man that was walking with a pitcher of water. They entered the house where he entered. They asked the master of the house about the guest chamber. He showed them, and that's where they kept the Passover. Jesus likewise manifested his knowledge by knowing what men were thinking. On one occasion, 4 men, having great faith in the power of Jesus, brought a dear friend of theirs that was sick with palsy. The 4 of them bore him, and Jesus saw their faith. And when he saw their faith, he said to the man that was sick of palsy, "Son, your sins be forgiven you." Now those that were around, the rulers, they were ones that said nothing, but they thought plenty. And they thought, this man blasphemes. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus said to them, regarding this matter, he said, as far as the forgiving sins, which is easier to say, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say to this man that you see is sick and not able to walk, arise, take up your bed and walk, and go to your house. And he did so. Now, my friend, that was a powerful measure. He knew what they were thinking. On another occasion, in the city of Capernaum, I believe, he was invited by a Pharisee named Simon to eat with him. And so he did. And as they were eating, a sinful woman in the city came, knowing Jesus was in the house, and she wept. She wet his feet with her tears. She dried them with her hair. She anointed him. Now that host didn't say anything. He just thought. He thought of plenty. And he thought within himself, if this man was truly a prophet, he would know what kind of a woman that she is, that she's a sinner. And Jesus knew what Simon was thinking. So he asked him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." And Simon said, "Say on, Master." And Jesus said, there was a man that had 2 debtors. One owed him 500 pence, another owed him 50. And he frankly forgave them both. Now, which one of them do you suppose you'll love the most? And he said, "Well, I suppose the one to whom he forgave the most." And Jesus said, "Yeah, that's right, Simon." He said, "You see this woman? I came into your house. You didn't greet me with a kiss. You didn't give me water for my feet. But here is this woman that she's not ceased to kiss my feet, and she's wiped my feet with her hair, and her sins, which are many, are forgiven." Jesus knew what men were thinking. And he knew what it was that Judas was about to do. And he said, "I'm telling you right now, he's going to betray me." And he said, "So that when it comes to pass, you will know that I am he." And a few hours later, Judas betrayed the master with that betrayer's kiss. But at the same time, that Peter, who had said, "Master, though all others forsake you, I never will," Jesus said, "Peter, this very night, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. "No," Peter said, "not me, Lord. I won't ever do that." And a servant of the high priest, in whose house the trial was being made, and Peter was there. She said, "You're one of his disciples, aren't you?" She said, No, I'm not." Another said, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him? Aren't you one of his disciples?" He says, No, I'm not." And then a third group of men, as Peter stood around the fire by which they were warming themselves, said, "You are one of his disciples. You are a Galilean, and your speech betrays you." And Peter began to curse and to swear and says, "I don't know him." And then suddenly he heard a rooster crowing. And the words of Jesus came back to him before the cock shall crow, "You will deny me 3 times. He thought of those, and he turned quickly. And he looked And he saw Jesus looking at him. And he went out and he wept bitterly. Jesus was God then. And Jesus is God now. And he still has that same supernatural knowledge, divine knowledge of the things that are taking place in this world. Of his knowledge, he said, and to the Father, that not one sparrow shall fall to the earth without the knowledge of the Father. He sees when a single worthless sparrow dies and falls to the ground. And we might likewise surmise that because he has that knowledge, when I step on an ant, and that ant is crushed to death, and the life is gone from him, God knows that too. He knows all there is to know about me. He knows what I think. He knows what I do. He knows what I say. He knows about you too. He knows what you think. He knows what you do. He knows what you say. And as each of us look at our hearts, we know that if we're going to be saved, it's going to take the grace of God for us to be saved. And we thank God for his grace. We thank God for his love. And we thank God for his mercy. Just remember, the Bible teaches us that all things are naked and laid open before the eyes of him we have to do. God is aware of us, of the betrayal of Jesus. Jesus said, I have told you beforehand that when it comes to pass, you will know I'm he. Of the denial of Peter, Jesus said, I told you beforehand that it transpires and comes to pass, you will know that I'm he. Today, he has manifestly declared himself by the seed of the Son of God. We must believe in him. We must acknowledge him. And we must follow him. God has reflected his Son to us. He's demonstrated in the sacrifice of that Son his divine love and care for us. And greater love hath no man than this, than that a man laid down his life for his friends. Thank you for listening today.